Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Please do help yourselves to refreshments. There are sandwiches and drinks at the back, and move up to the front. Thank you all for coming to our second Qahwa and Kalam event for this semester. This is the lunch hour series of the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations, and usually we try to host faculty members and guest speakers who speak to us about their ongoing and recent research. And today we are honored, I am particularly honored to be hosting my colleague and mentor, Professor Nelly Hanna. Many of you, of course, will know Professor Hanna is Distinguished University Professor here at the AUC, and she served as visiting professor in various universities abroad. Dr. Hanna has also received a number of honors, including in 2004 the AUC Research Award, and a couple of books have been already published in her honor. Today we are hoping to speak about her more recent book, Empires in Friction. It comes as an 8th monograph after a number of important publications. Her earliest work involved studying Boulay, the neighborhood of Boulay in the Ottoman period, and I believe that was part of your thesis, for MA thesis here at the AUC. An interesting factoid is Professor Hanna started out studying English literature in her BA and first MA before moving on to Islamic art and architecture for her second MA, and then moving to history for her PhD. And if anything, it shows you the interdisciplinarity of our field, and I think all of this informs her work in a lot of ways. Her PhD project focused on middle-class housing in Cairo in the 17th and 18th centuries. And since then, she's also, sorry, this runs too quickly. She's published a number of important monographs in our field, including Making Big Money in 1600, which was in many ways the beginning or the first major micro-history in Middle East history. She's worked also on culture, popular culture and popularization and book culture in praise of books, and on artisans, craftsmen and entrepreneurs in Artisan Entrepreneurs in 2011. She's also already published a general book on Ottoman Egypt and the emergence of the modern world, and edited a number of different volumes as well. So today's book, as you know, is Empires in Friction, Egypt in the 16th century. It's been published by AUC Press as well in an Egypt edition, and the Arabic translation is out from الدار المصرية اللبنانية, translated by our colleague Dr. Magdi Girgis. And we want to thank them both publishers, for having copies out here for sale at a discount. So if any of you want to pick up a copy, you can do that today. I want to start by asking you, Professor Hanna, what brought you to Ottoman Egypt in particular? So as we saw, just looking at the various works, big monographs and big research projects you've been working on since Boulay, since your early work on Boulay, much of your work has centered around Ottoman Egypt. What was the first instigator or question that piqued your curiosity and brought you to this time and place?
Well, the truth is that I didn't really choose. I think a lot of things that happen in one's life come by accident, and that was by accident that I fell into Ottoman studies, not by choice. I was interested in, after the publication by the French Institute, the IFAO, published a series of books on the palaces of Cairo, Palais et Maison du Caire. And I figured out, but how about everybody else? Everybody lives in palaces is not possible. So there must be a lot of houses that are not palaces. And I started walking around the city and found a lot of houses that were not palaces of the 17th century, 16th century, 18th century, and they were not palaces. And so when I did my PhD, I figured out this is the subject I wanted to do. I was not thinking of Ottoman or Mamluk or anything like that. But it so happened that the houses were built later than the Mamluk period. So that is how I entered the Mamluk period, the Ottoman period. So it's really by accident, not by choice. But I think that happens very often in people's lives. They don't always choose the path that their lives take.
Yeah, and coincidence plays a role. So having entered into the world of the Ottoman Empire, how have you come to understand it as an empire? What does it have in common with other empires? How is it different and unique and distinct from other empires?
How is it different from other empires?
Or what makes it an empire
The focus
even?
in this particular book, the focus is on 16th century empires. So it's not the same as every empire. It's different from modern colonial empires. Conditions in the 16th century were particular. And that's how I found quite a lot of similarities between the Ottoman Empire and the other empires that were flourishing in the 16th century. I mean the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Portuguese Empire from Brazil to the Philippines, yeah, something enormous. The Dutch Empire in Indonesia, we would say now. So there are many, the French Empire in the 16th century, and I found many of them faced the same kind of issue. They all faced the problem of distance. How do you communicate with an empire that is many thousands or many hundreds of kilometers away? So this was always a problem. It was a problem for the Ottomans. It was a problem for all the other empires at the time. The problem of the technology available in the 16th century was also something that they all had in common. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, one of the main concerns of the Ottoman Empire was to collect the tribute. It so happened that the most important tribute in Egypt is from the land tax. Well, how did they measure the land? How did they know how taxes are collected? How could they delineate between state land and non-state land? Very difficult. There's no technical, it was by tradition. There is a river or there is a tree that divides between state land and non-state land. Or you can put a few stones to divide between state land and non-state land. All these are issues that survive until the 19th century. It's not only the Ottomans, it's not only the Dutch and the French, it's everybody's problem. So the Ottomans faced the same kind of problem that many other empires were facing. I don't know if that answers your question.
In a way, it does. And I mean, we'll get to also the limitations of power in a few minutes. Now, in popular discourse, especially in Egypt, people often compare the Ottoman conquest of Egypt to modern colonial occupations. We often see this parallel between 1516, 1517, and 1882, for example. What's your view on this? Is this a valid comparison? And if it's valid and we follow through that thread, what are the similarities and differences?
I often get asked, how can one view the Ottoman conquest of Egypt? Is it an invasion or is it an, what's the other word they use?
Expansion?
It's simple expansion. I think people sometimes make a false comparison between empires of the 16th century and modern colonial empires. Modern colonial empires had different objectives. They have different methods that did not exist prior to 1800. For example, modern colonial empires wanted settler land, like in Algeria. The French conquered Algeria in 1830. They wanted to settle their own people in the land that belonged to the Algerians, the peasants, yani. So peasants were removed and the land was given to new settlers. We don't have that kind of thing prior to, we don't have that in the Ottoman period. The modern empires tried to change the structure of the economy. The idea of landed property is a modern idea. In the Ottoman period, the land belongs to the state. So you don't have this privatization of things. I mean, privatization of land comes much later, middle of the 19th century, for example. So the Ottomans want, in general, 16th century empires want money, they want trade. I mean, the trading for pepper, European empires were looking for spices and pepper, for goods, for commodities. So trade was very important, tribute was very important, but there's no attempt to completely restructure the culture and the economy of the occupied land. They did not impose the Turkish language, for example. The Dutch did not impose Dutch in Indonesia, but the English did try. At least impose it on the elites, on the ruling elites, the local ruling elites, by building schools and so on. So it's a different situation. It's not really comparable on all sides. It's not because it's an occupation that all occupations are the same. They're not.
Well, that makes sense. In trying to understand the relationship between the center and the margins, between the capital and the imperial bureaucracy and court and the margins, you speak of the concept of the centrality of the margins. Can you explain this concept a little bit more? How are the margins central?
Okay, I can answer, but in a somewhat different way. When we have a lot of studies on the Ottomans now, and a lot of these studies focus on the 16th century, and a lot of the studies on the 16th century focus on Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, because he ruled a long time, 1520 to 66, yeah, and that's about more than 40 years. And what has been a common way of writing history is to focus on the Sultan, to focus on the capital city, which in a way is normal because that's where the tribute comes, that's where the Sultan is residing, that's where the ruling classes are residing, that's where the archives are, where the tribute is. So this is, the normal thing to do. The provinces have been considered as sort of a diluted form or a declined form of what is going on in the center. That's where the idea of the center of margins comes in. Does it really mean that provinces like Egypt or other provinces of the empire, because it's a very big empire, are marginal? Does living in the margin live that you are marginal? It's not the same thing. You can be living in a marginal area, but not be marginal in the sense that you are not so important, that you are peripheral, that you're not playing a role, that you have no agency. It can mean many things. So the whole idea is, and that I think is one of the main ideas I wanted to communicate in my book, is can we understand an empire by simply looking at what the archives of the capital city tell us? The orders of the Sultan, the decisions of the Sultan, what the ruling class does, what the ruling class says. And my answer is, we can do the opposite. We can study the empire. We can also, not instead of, but in addition to, we can study the empire from a province and come up with conclusions that are relevant for all of the empire, including the center. So that is, in theory, what I try to say in my book.
And one of the very interesting things towards the end of the book, you also show how practice in ruling the province / margin of Egypt also affected imperial decisions and imperial practice. So you speak, for instance, about the way in which local notables in Egypt entrenched themselves in Egypt's agricultural and tax systems, and how that came to also be copied or carried into other provinces of the empire, where local notables came to play similar roles. So in general, are you also trying to say then that Ottoman practice and experience in Egypt affected the Ottoman Empire as empire, or affected the practice of power by the empire elsewhere in its other regions and provinces?
Yani this implies many channels of thought, actually. I think what I was trying to communicate in that book. Can you ask the question?
So the ripple effect, as it were, experiences or things that the Ottomans learned or experienced or that developed through their rule of Egypt come to be imitated in other provinces of the empire.
Yeah.
In a way, the influence of things in Egypt, practices they've learned in Egypt or they've learned through ruling Egypt, come to be copied and imitated elsewhere.
Yeah, I remember that, but
It's okay. Anyway, it's one of the ideas that
one clear example. But so, يعني in reality, what was really relevant was to show that the Ottoman. يعني, if you study Egypt, you can understand the difficulties of administration. When the Ottomans come to Egypt, like I said, they need revenues, they need tribute, they want the land tax, but they are not able to get it. They are not able to get it in full, at least. They're not able to get it because they do not, when they arrive here, they don't know the language, they're not familiar with the situation, they don't know how things work, and of course we have to keep in mind that the Mamluk bureaucracy was extremely complex, extremely sophisticated. I don't think we would understand it. Yani, you can read a lot about it, and it's never quite clear how it was undertaken because it was changing very often. It was being adapted to situations all the time. And so it's very difficult to follow. So I want to say when they come, they need to find out how taxes are collected. They need to find out where the registers are kept, and they have to be explained to them. Well, they go to the persons in charge. Everybody tells them a different story. First of all, they tell them the registers were burnt. Somebody else tells them the registers are kept in the house of the secretaries of the office. Sometimes they tell them, you better go to the Sultan himself and ask him, he's under arrest. Better ask him while he's still alive, where are the registers for that? Nobody tells them. This is in 1517 to 1520. 30 years later, they're still asking for the registers. In 1550, we have a land law arriving in Egypt, an order coming in Egypt, and the order is still complaining. We are still not sure what is the land that is state-owned and what are the taxes to be collected. 30 years later, they had still not fully penetrated the administration of Egypt. The secrets of the administration of tax collection. They got a lot of taxes, yes, but not all. They never got all of them throughout the 16th century. They were never able to get full tribute that they were expecting. It was always missing here or there. Why? Because the actual system of taxation implied so many people between the peasant who was paying the tax, the local administrator who took it from the peasant. He sent it to Cairo where there were officials who also took a bit of a share. We know that because they became very rich. We have their a record of how rich some of them became, like Ibrahim Bey Defteridar. He was in charge of the finances of Egypt, and he became a very, very rich man. So somehow there's some money that goes into everybody's pocket before it reaches Istanbul. So is that only in Egypt, or is that something common to other provinces? That's the question. We have a lot of complaints from other provinces that say more or less the same thing. In Bilad al-Sham, in Syria, for example, 30, 40 years after the conquest, the person in charge of financial administration never sent a register. And we have the complaint from Istanbul. We never got a register from this, I can't remember which city, Hama or Homs or something like that. We never got a register. We're talking about 30 years later or 40 years later. So it all comes out into the question, where is power? Is power centered in Istanbul, or is power diffused among a lot of people? Some of them are very unimportant. Some of them, we don't know who they are. We don't know their names. They're not officials. They're not political figures. But somehow down the line, many people get some advantage. And so I think, I mean, the bigger question of my book was, where is power? Historians of the Ottoman Empire who write their work based on Istanbul archives will tend to write that power is centered in the hands of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He's extremely powerful Sultan. He's a very long-lasting Sultan. I mean, he ruled for about 40 years. And so it is presumed, and he also issued many, many orders all over the empire. And so if you read the orders, you get the impression of power, strength, reprimands, orders, punishments here and there, exile of officials, execution of people who don't obey his orders. All this is in the archives of Istanbul. But if you look at the realities down the line, you get another picture, at least as far as tax collection is concerned, which is one of the important functions of the province, and is to send tribute to Istanbul. So you get another picture. And I think that picture, when I compared it to other empires, it all fit. When the French were complaining that their people, their officials in India were not sending the right amount of money, were disobeying orders. You get it in the British Empire even much later. Officials are not obeying us. It always comes back. And I think it goes to the same issue. There is a problem of distance. There is a problem of communication. There are no phones or telegrams or anything like that. There are letters going back and forth. But the letters take, to come from Istanbul, it could take between 2 weeks, if things are good. If the weather is bad, it could take 2 months or 3 months.
So you discussed the limitations of power a lot in the book, and the difficulty for a pre-modern empire to centralize, even though, you know, centralization is part of the 16th century narrative and story as you tell it. There were enormous limitations on their power. But also, what played did resistance, or what role did resistance play in this? In other words, how did people down the line also resist Ottoman power, react to it by not conforming?
I think resistance is matter. I mean, I didn't work on, I don't think we have a lot of information on actual protests. Of course, you're the expert on that. Or actual acts of resistance. But the resistance I see is the resistance where people are concerned with their own self-interest. The peasant is concerned with the amount of tax he has to pay. The person in the Ottoman administration of Cairo and the Basha are also concerned. By the way, they were people who were sometimes very, very obedient servants to the state, but they also had their private concerns. They also looked for their own private enrichment. So that's how I see resistance in that particular context. Yeah, and there's not much information on resistance in the sense that you find in your own work.
Not in the sense of rioting, but I mean...
Of collective resistance. I don't think I saw any
In some sections of the book, for instance,
in that particular period. Yeah.
you speak, for instance, in the chapter where you discuss land reforms, you speak a bit about the reaction of local ulama in Egypt and the fatwa that they issued that tried to argue, for example, that the Ottoman laws of the mid-16th century that dealt with land reforms or that were meant to reappropriate lands to the imperial treasury, that these were not legally sound, unjust, etc. And in that, there seems to be at least a discourse of resistance to imperial power, even if, as you say, this is not collective action or direct action as such.
Yes, I think the land law, there's a very important article written by Stanford Shaw, who was one of the experts of Ottoman Egypt, even though it's quite old, I think, published in 1962. The land law of the Sultanate, yani, it arrives in Egypt in 1553. And that caused, I mean, we don't have chronicles. It's very difficult to put things together. Yani, that book is bits and pieces from many, many different sources. We don't have a narrative for the 16th century. We don't have a chronicle for the 16th, that covers the 16th century. So we take bits and pieces from different parts. And that particular article was very important for my own work. And that particular period was very, shall we say, a turning point insofar as land issues were concerned. Because we find I think it's for the first time as far as the 16th century goes, when the land law, which was a confirmation of what had been done in 1517 when the Ottomans come, we want our land. Yani. What they want to say is the Ottoman state wants its full rights on state land, and it's not getting them. So there's a kind of frustration. And they issued this land law in 1553 to confirm state land. And the governor of Cairo immediately starts asking people, please, everybody come with their deeds of ownership if they have any. And of course, people don't have their deeds of ownership because the deeds of ownership are 3 generations ago, or something like that. And so the result is there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension between the state and the representatives of the state and the people who want to protect their land. And it so happens that some of it was waqf land. And so this is where the ulama come in and they issue one after another. Yes,
Al-Ghaiti and Ibn Nujim.
Was Ibn Nujim. I mean, there are very important scholars of the of the 16th century who are very much against this land law that is issued by the state officials, because in a way they are so eager to have this land that people have to come with deeds, and not everybody has deeds, and so it creates a lot of tension. And Ibn Nujim and El-Ghaiti take the side, of course, of the locals. So it's a time of tension. We can clearly see that.
You just mentioned that one of the challenges is we don't have a master narrative of the 16th century. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as a silent century. How did you go about dealing with that challenge? In many of your works, in your previous works, you relied on a multiplicity of primary sources. Definitely Ottoman court registers are ones that you are an expert on and have mined extensively for a variety of projects, whether for studying merchants such as Ismail Abu Ta'iyya, or the artisans, or even book ownership, or the houses in middle-class houses. But here you were dealing with a different project. You were studying empire, presumably, and as you've just been explaining to us, studying empire almost from below. You were not concerned only with what the center of power was doing, what the capital or the sultan were doing. You were interested in power as it was diffused and as it was practiced and as it was received by a wider group of people. But then how do you go about finding primary sources that help you with this particular century that is notoriously silent? How did you pick up those bits and pieces, as you were saying? How did it come to you, even as a methodological question? Because I'm sure also for many of our graduate students, we're all faced with these questions. You have big questions, and you have a context that doesn't give you the classical primary sources you're looking for. That doesn't, I mean, Ibn Iyas stops 1525 or something, and you don't have a major chronicler of the same stature.
No, we don't have there are a few chronicles that have appeared recently, but they tend to be specific to specific events. So it was a real problem to put together this book because of the lack of. So in fact, what I did was in every chapter required different, completely different sources, which is why the book took so long to come into being.
It's almost as if every chapter is a different study.
Every chapter was different. Every chapter.
So I mean, one
sources.
chapter is on the bureaucrats, the Mamluks or the people who did the transition from one empire to another.
For that, for example, I relied on someone called Al-Ghaziri, who was in charge of the pilgrimage. He worked in the Cairo office of the pilgrimage to Mecca. And he wrote, he's living in this period and he wrote about it. So he has quite a bit of information on about 10 or 20 years of before the first half of the 16th century. And he talked a lot about a person that I could focus on, and that person was called Ibrahim Bey al-Diftardar. Ibrahim Bey al-Diftardar, this is very important. He was a Mamluk, which means that the Ottomans employed a Mamluk emir to head the financial office of Egypt. Now, why would they do that? Obviously, because it was the only way for them to find out about the ins and outs of finances. Well, this man that Al-Ghaziri talks about, we know of his existence, we know of how important he was from Al-Ghaziri. The rest of his book is on the pilgrimage. But he does talk for about 20 years, year by year. He talks about his experiences, and he was well connected. He was well connected in higher circles. And he gives us a very good idea of Al-Ghaziri. It is very important to find out, because we really didn't know, that the Ottomans were so lost trying to find out how the finances worked that they had to employ an Egyptian local Mamluk to take care of the finances. And guess what? He became extremely rich.
Yeah, but he didn't end well, did he?
The next Basha killed him, but that's okay. That's how we know how rich he was, because they entered his palace as they were the 400 slaves, and there were 100,000 golden dinars, and he tells us exactly what they found in the house. But the other Basha took it. So it's okay. One harami bisra harami. So I want to say, okay, the next chapter, the chapter on land, I had to rely on the sources of fiqh and fatwas. The fatwas that Amina just mentioned have a lot of information on what happened every day and how people reacted and why we're against this land law and how are people harmed by it and so on and so forth. So I relied a lot on fatwas. When I talked about trade, I mean, every chapter had a different kind of source. I relied on, it's very interesting because the Ottoman state had a certain ideology. Our officials get a lot of money, but they should not be working inside jobs. I worked on the waqfs of Ottoman bashas appointed to govern Egypt. A lot of them, we find out from their waqfs, had wakalas and had ships that they were renting to get some money, and they were involved in trade, and they had goods and merchandise. So it was a way to see how their own officials, their own very high officials that they depended upon, did a lot for them. Served the Sultan in many ways, but also had their own private businesses in contradiction to the regulations and the laws of the empire.
It's fascinating. It was a good deal. Everybody wanted to be governor of Egypt.
It was
right?
a
Mustafa
very
Ali
high
tried
post,
several
very high
times,
post.
never got it.
Yeah, and Egypt, I should say, was the most important province of the empire and the richest province of the empire.
Which is it's a bit of an irony, because here is you speak of it being the highest contributing to the treasury, to the budget, and yet it is so difficult to get money from Egypt and so difficult to.
Well, that's the information that's available to us. It seems to me, I conclude that Egypt must have been very, very rich, agriculturally. And even when the budget was missing, the tribute was less than it should be, even though there was still a lot going to Istanbul.
I want to give our audience a chance to ask you some questions as well. I've monopolized the microphone for enough already, I guess. It's a fascinating book, but I'm sure many of our colleagues and members of the audience have questions to ask. So we'll start here, and then President Dalal.
Okay. When Napoleon Bonaparte came to Egypt, this was late 16th century, he was actually fighting a Mamluk army at the Battle of the Pyramids. Mamluks were not dislodged except by Muhammad Ali when he killed Muhammad al-Alfi. So my guess is that the Ottomans, the way they've dealt with it, they've kept them. As long as, because those guys know they're local, they know how to get the money, as long as they pay the taxes, we're fine. So I don't think they sort of were very keen of dislodging them completely. They kept them. And there are many indications that they were left. Murad Bek was until the British and the French were acting, and he was also a Mamluk. So there are many indications that the Mamluk were as strong as long as they paid the dues. So I just want to get your feed about...
Yes, we have a lot of information in Ibn Iyas. In Ibn Iyas, who's the historian who lived through the Ottoman invasion, tells us quite a little bit about what happened. There's no doubt when the Ottomans came, they massacred many, many Mamluks. They just killed them in the streets. That's a lot of them. A few of them were integrated in the administration of Mamluks. Yeah, and they were sent as bashas in Ethiopia. They were sent as bashas, as governors in Yemen. So they became integrated, like Ibrahim Bey Diftaldar, but he's exceptional because he was in Egypt. The others, they kept them away. But the important thing is that in 1517, they took their money. They took their iltizam, so they had you could be a Mamluk, but you had no money anymore. You had no power. You were no longer a class. That comes with time. Yeah, and by the 17th, 18th century, they regroup. The purchase of people continues, but they're no longer a class. They no longer have power or money until they are able to recuperate again by the time of, a bit before Murad Bey, of course. Yeah, and it's a recurrent. They become a ruling class, but not rulers, of course.
Dr. Nelly.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna. You always force us to think outside the box and to rethink our assumptions. The Arabic translation of your book suggests something which is not, the title suggests something which is not implied in the English title. ما بين إمبراطوريتين, which is not, I mean, you know, empires and friction. I think, you know, I think there is something very important about the title in Arabic, because you're suggesting that in the 16th century, there is something which is emerging, which is fall in between. So my question to you is, how do you define an empire? When do we move from a centralized, strong state? I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a state until it acquired Egypt. Then it became an empire. When do we start? When do you decide to qualify something as an empire as opposed to a centralized state? What is the empire before the Ottoman Empire in Egypt? And if I may also pick your brain, because I know how rich the material you work with on is. What is the role of culture in empires?
What is the role?
Of culture in empires.
Okay.
One more, if I may. I mean, you know, you did talk about pre-colonial, and you know, I completely agree with you. And even in one period, there's a difference between the French Empire and the British Empire, and so on. What do you make of city-states? City-states.
What about them?
Are they empire? They have a settler ideology. They are the beginning of settler ideologies, which actually informed the later colonial empires, is way before. So where do you place the city-states in this narrative?
Okay. Remind me of the first one.
بين إمبراطورات.
When do you become an empire? طبعا that's a difficult question. It's difficult for me to answer exactly. I mean, when the Ottomans first started, they're called an emirate because it's small, and then it expands, and then they take Constantinople and call it Istanbul. Maybe that's the time when it's a new land, it's a new culture. I mean, when they take Constantinople, it's a new land, it's a new culture. It's people who speak another language, the Greeks and the Armenians. Maybe that's the point at which you can say it's an empire. Maybe it's when you extend to a land, I don't want to say that doesn't belong to you, because it's not a matter of belonging, but it's another culture, it comes by conquest. We can call that an empire. It doesn't come by voting or anything like that. So it's a difficult question, but I mean, for the Ottomans, I would say the conquest of Constantinople is the turning point. But of course, the other turning point is the conquest of the 16th century. It's the conquest of whole of the Arab lands, in stages. Syria, and then Egypt, and then Yemen, and then and then Tunis. So that is a big change for the Ottoman Empire. For the Ottoman Empire, it means for the first time when they conquer after the 16th century. In the 16th century, it becomes a Muslim majority empire. So that's a big change. And it's a big change that is reflected in the center. The incorporation of all these Arab-speaking lands, all of this Muslim population is reflected immediately, right away, when they appoint, what's his name? Sheikh Abu Saud. The duty of Sheikh Abu Saud is to see that all the orders and all the laws issued by the empire are not against the Sharia. It's a big job. And they only think about it after they conquer the Arab land. So the conquest of the Arab land did change the center. That's one aspect of history from below. How the periphery changes the center. How the periphery, if you want to call it the periphery, we're not really periphery, but we use this word. How the existence of the periphery, how the incorporation of the periphery, as it's supposed to be marginal and peripheral, but in fact it changes the center, it changes the core in many other ways too. I'm just saying in terms of religion, but of course in many other ways. The conquest of Egypt changed the nature of the Ottoman economy. Should I say why?
If you want to, sure. But
No, I mean, because I didn't go to question number 2. In 1500, just before the conquest, there were 2 important, one or 2, I'm forgetting the dates, international ports in the Ottoman Empire. And when they had Eastern Europe, there was Istanbul as an international port, and a bit later, the port of Salonika. Bas, full stop. When they conquered Egypt, they added, international ports for international trade. They added Alexandria and Rashid, and Gaza and Beirut, Egypt and Syria, and in the Red Sea, Qusayr and Suez. And inside Egypt, they could also use international ports, Fawwa and Damanhur. And Taban, not to mention and Yemen. The Red Sea is very important. For international trade, it's number 1. So the whole economy of Ottoman Empire is adapted to a new commercial system, which they didn't have before. So the margins do change the empire, to answer your question. But your second question?
culture.
What was the question about culture?
The role of culture in empire. It's something you've
Empire or in the
You've worked on culture in your other books, but maybe not through the lens of empire as such. You've worked on popularization of culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, the rise of a middling class, a reading middle class, the vernacularization of Arabic.
To put it differently, can we think of an empire without a cultural project?
Let's, for the sake of the recording also, can we think of an empire without a cultural project?
I don't think there is a cultural project as such, as I see it in the Ottoman Empire. I think, like I just said, when they conquered the Arab lands, all of the Arab lands, I think there is an attempt to Islamicize a certain level of culture. They're not killing themselves going, but they do have a certain policy, and maybe it filters down. The idea of having Sharia courts systematically, this is doesn't happen before. There were courts and there were qadis, but not as extensive and as systematized as under the Ottomans. So I think this also has to do, it has to do with religion, but it also has to do with culture. It does affect culture. Otherwise, I do not think that empires of the 16th century were imposing their cultures on conquered lands. That comes later.
But we can speak of an Ottomanization of sorts, and courts are part of it. Maybe not necessarily in terms of imposing a language, but imposing a philosophy of rule, a culture of rule. We can have one more question. We're running out of time because some people will want to go to class and some people will want to get books. Dr. Tamer, sorry.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk and for the wonderful ideas in the book. I have a couple of very small questions. One of them, back to the title. I see the book as belonging to this new historiography or recent historiography, a new imperial historiography from the 90s or so, right? You put the center and the periphery in the same analytical frame. You want to give more voice to the provinces, etc. Those are usually works that use tension, and I wonder what friction is doing in the title here. for you? Is it something that you conceive of as being different from them? The second one, the continuity of somebody like the Mamluk. Sorry, the continuity of keeping somebody like the Mamluk Amir who became a Daftardar. If we look to earlier empires, wasn't that basically what everyone did? You just removed the threatening political heads, and you definitely kept all the bureaucracy because no one else knows how to do this, right? From the Arab-Muslim conquests, even Mongols, everyone I know has never dabbled with that. And then the comparison I was surprised by was Mexico and New Spain, because there, I think there was to the Spanish Empire. There was, for the first time, a cultural project, a religious project of missionizing, right? It was a colonialism and missionizing. It was an attempt to turn people into a reflection of the colonizer, while still, of course, maintaining an ideology of racial difference, all of which I don't really see in the Ottoman Empire. So,
I agree. Now, the first question was?
About the title, what friction? Because empires in friction made me, when I started reading, thinking that we were going to talk about the Mamluk Empire and commensurability, or
I agree with you. I don't like the title very much, not the English title. I prefer the Arabic title. Is more in keeping with the book, but titles have to be negotiated with publishers. But I did not disagree when the publisher suggested, or whoever suggested the friction, because there was a lot of friction. And I see this throughout the 16th century, different levels of friction. There is a friction when, the massacre of Mamluks, it was a very bloody time for Mamluks. Of course there was friction. This friction, people had multiple standards, not multiple standards. People like Ibrahim Daftardar was very hybrid person. He was both serving the Ottomans and carrying out Mamluk interests, his own and others. So I think the tension is there. Maybe tension would have been better, but you can't put that in a title. But it reflects better the idea of the book. There is a tension in many levels. Because there are different interests. Everybody is looking for their own interests, and that creates tension. And it is a time when, before things, settle down, maybe that comes later, or maybe at the very, very last chapter of the book, a kind of a smoothing out of tensions. But otherwise, you can remove the word friction and say tensions, and maybe that would be better to fit with the content of the book. That was the first question. The second?
The Spanish Empire and
experience. I agree. I overstated.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Professor Hanna, for this wonderful conversation. And thank you all for coming. I'm sure everybody's going to leave with a lot of questions as well and things to think about.
Thank you for organizing this, Amina.
It's my pleasure. And as we said, please help yourselves to refreshments. And there are copies of both the Arabic and English books outside the hall if you want to get a copy. Thank you. And I think you promised you could sign a few copies if anybody asked.